The room was laced with the scent of rosemary from the roast and the faint chemical bite of fresh paint, an odd attempt at warmth that somehow still felt unfamiliar. Glasses clinked softly under the golden glow of the lights at the Greyhound, a cozy little pub in the heart of Manchester, and right there, in front of me, on a checkered tablecloth, wasn't a plate of food but a thick folder of documents, neatly placed like the main course of the evening. All you have to do is sign here. Mom, won't take a second. Callum, my son, whispered. His voice honeyed, gentle, but with an edge as cold as steel. My fingers brushed the leather cover. It felt dry and cold, like a December wind in Stockport. Before I go any further, if you're listening to this story, do subscribe and drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from. This happened in Manchester. Yes, but truthfully, it could have happened anywhere in this country. This is supposed to be your engagement party, I said softly, managing a strained smile as a waitress passed by with a basket of warm bread. Sophie Callum's fiancé leaned in, her beige dress hugging her frame, her Chanel perfume overwhelming even the roast, and said, "Don't worry, Mum. All the paperwork's been checked. My dad's mate had a look. He's a financial advisor. Callum's startup is going to take off with this loan. It's a win for the whole family." I looked around. Relatives lined both sides of the long table. Vases of white lilies dotted between the dishes. A flickering neon sign in the corner spelling out Callum Hearts Sophie. In front of me, no fork, no knife. Just a silver pen laid precisely above bold text that read, "Sign here." Ed Sheeran's Perfect played softly in the background, sounding oddly out of place like it belonged to someone else's life. I'd sold my little council flat in Hume, the one where I made tea every rainy morning, the one I spent over 20 years saving for, to give them $60 €1 towards their house deposit. I moved into the storage room of their new build, squeezed between Sophie's beige decor boxes and the constant hum of a dehumidifier. I'd taken early retirement from the NHS, my back giving out before my will ever did, still believing I was useful. Believing home would always mean safety. But the scent in the air tonight wasn't roast or fresh paint. It was the whiff of something carefully orchestrated, wrapped in sugar-coated words like, "For the family." It's just a signature. "Mum," Callum repeated, nudging the folder closer. Sophie offered a polite smile. "We've got to act fast before interest rates go up again." I opened the folder. Page 1. Personal Guarantee Agreement. Next line. Maximum liability. What do any notes? Nerwele. My stomach dropped. The red-haired waitress with freckles paused as she passed, eyes flicking to our table, the folder. The empty spot where a plate should have been. "You all right?" "Love," she asked gently, "like a hand on your back." I nodded, brushing it off, though I caught Sophie's frown at the disruption. Sophie's father, Mr. Blake, sat across from me, crisp white shirt, a smile that belonged to a man used to spreadsheets and margins. Sign today and the funds land Monday. Just in time to order the equipment for the boutique gym. "This is a family opportunity." He said family, but I felt like the outsider. "What if the startup fails?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sophie poured Prosecco, eyes averted. "Then we pivot. You've already sold the old place. This one's obviously ours now. And you've got your room." A few chuckles rippled down the table. Someone filmed a story. I could hear my heartbeat loud and clear. I thought of the gold wedding ring Sophie borrowed for a video last week, still not returned. I remembered Callum switching my SIM card to a cheaper plan, saying it was to save money. I remembered the damp smell clinging to my jumper every morning on the 192 bus. Each memory clicked into place like clues in a mystery I hadn't realized I was living. "Go on, love," I said gently. Callum took a breath. "You're our rock. Mum. Sign this and we get better rates. It's just for a few months. You won't have to worry about bills anymore." Perfect. Right. But at the bottom of the page, in small print, default may result in repossession of guarantor's assets. I thought of the elderly patients I used to care for, the ones who'd plead with me. "Don't let them take my pension." Mr. Blake slid the silver pen toward me. "We've run the numbers." It felt like a syringe cold. Clinical, I offered a polite smile. "Where's my plate?" Then the waitress blinked, flustered, then quickly returned with a clean white dish and shiny cutlery. "Sorry, thought the table was set." "It is now," I replied, eyes fixed on Mr. Blake. I picked up the pen not to sign, but to tap it against the table. Tap, tap, tap. "If this is a celebration, why is my main course a loan agreement?" I asked. Sophie gave a thin, tight-lipped smile, her complexion paling. Callum placed a hand on my shoulder. "Mum, don't make a scene. Just sign." I lifted my hand, took a sip of water, its metallic taste bringing me back to earth. "After I sold my home and gave you 60, Noel, I thought at the very least my name would be on the deeds. But the council letter yesterday listed just yours." Callum froze. Sophie bit her lip. I spoke as if confiding in a friend. "I don't hate your dream. Son, but family doesn't mean free collateral. And I eat dinner off porcelain, not paperwork." I pushed the folder gently back. Sophie inhaled sharply. "If you don't sign, we lose the deposit. No honeymoon?" I glanced at the pub's chalkboard. "Today's special, roast and respect." I smiled softly. "Tonight's on me, but I'm only paying for dinner. As for the debt, that's all yours." The table fell into stunned silence. From the next booth, the faint clatter of cutlery. The pub door swung open, a cool breeze flickering the candle in front of me wobbling, then steadying again, just like me, because tonight's dinner wasn't for the hungry, it was for those trying to swallow my future whole. I set down my knife and fork, looked Callum squarely in the eyes, and said quietly, "Not tonight. Love, when I left the Greyhound that night, I didn't look back. Manchester after dark was as busy as ever, but inside me was a thick, heavy silence. The April wind swept along Deansgate, carrying the usual blend of beer and cigarette smoke, but none of it could drown out the bitter aftertaste left by that dinner table. I pulled my coat tighter and made my way quickly to the bus stop. Callum and Sophie's words replaying in my head like a jammed cassette. Back home, or rather, the semi-detached house Callum and Sophie proudly called their nest, I unlocked the storeroom with my own key. It was barely a room, just enough space for a single bed, a 3-drawer plastic cabinet, and a hanging rail. The damp crept into every fold of the bedding. Despite the moisture absorbers I'd scattered from Poundland, on the bedside shelf sat a half-finished bottle of painkillers from my NHS days, beside an old alarm clock whose ticking was louder than the hallway dehumidifier. I took early retirement after nearly 30 years as a nurse at Salford Royal. A slip disc meant I couldn't stand for more than 4 hours at a time, and you can't exactly ask for a sit-down break in nursing. When my husband David died of a heart attack 6 years ago, Callum was 27 and still working retail at a sports equipment shop. It was just the two of us then. I'd promised myself I'd always be there for him, partly out of love, partly out of fear of being alone. Last year, Callum met Sophie through a Facebook gym group. Sophie called herself a decor influencer. I never quite grasped what that entailed, only that the house was constantly filled with parcels, furniture pieces, rugs, picture frames, armchairs all waiting to be reviewed. Her aesthetic was Scandi minimalism, which apparently meant the fewer colors, the more chic. Everything was beige, cream or white. Sophie said the smell of bleach was the scent of clean, whereas the hospital-grade disinfectant I brought from my old job gave her headaches. I once had a 2-bedroom council flat in Hume. Small, yes, but every curtain was hung by me. Every shelf drilled with care. The kitchen had a south-facing window that let in golden sunlight on summer mornings, making even a simple cup of tea feel warm and alive. But when Callum and Sophie said they'd found the perfect starter home close to schools, with a back garden, I immediately thought of selling my flat to help with the deposit. It's just temporary. "Mom," Callum had said when I moved into the storage room, "once we're settled, you'll have a proper room upstairs." Sophie nodded with a sweet smile. "Just a few weeks. Lydia, we want everyone to feel comfortable." And I believed them. Who would have thought those few weeks would stretch into over 8 months in the beginning? I tried to fit in. I got up early to cook breakfast. bought flowers to brighten the dining table. But over time, the little things revealed the truth. I wasn't part of the household, I was merely an unwanted lodger. First, the SIM card. Callum convinced me to switch to a 5-month prepaid plan to save money. You don't need data. Mom, just calls and texts, he said. Then Sophie suggested merging our bank accounts for household budgeting, which I politely declined. One morning, I found my wedding ring, the only thing I had left from my life, with David on Sophie's dressing table. Oh, I borrowed it for a vintage touch video. I'll return it in a bit. She giggled. That bit never came. Even the way they used the house made it clear I was a footnote. Sophie turned the lounge into her recording studio and banned me during live stream hours. My old bookshelf was dismantled, replaced with a plain white wall for aesthetic purposes. The back garden, where I'd once dreamt of planting lavender, was taken over by a rattan sofa set for content photo shoots. Mr. Patel, the next-door neighbor, was the only one I could have a real conversation with. He used to be an accountant, now retired and babysitting his grandchildren. One afternoon, as I was hanging laundry in the garden, he leaned over the fence and said quietly, "I've noticed those two spend rather freely, fancy things all the time, but they're behind on council tax. Just keep your wits about you." Lydia, I nodded in thanks. But in my heart, I told myself he was probably being overcautious. But the signs kept piling up. Letters began arriving from the bank marked confirmation of transaction authorization. One day, I opened a parcel to find a photocopy of a power of attorney form with my forged signature on it. I asked Callum about it. He laughed it off. "Oh, must be a mix-up at the bank." Don't worry. But when I offered to go to the bank with him, he suddenly changed the subject. The financial pressure on them was becoming harder to ignore. Callum spoke more about interest rates rising than he did about the weather. Sophie kept ordering more decor items, mini treadmills, massage chairs, all under the pretext of review content for income, though I never saw a penny from those ventures. Then came the boutique home gym idea. If you co-sign the loan, Mom, the bank will fast-track approval. Callum told me, startups are trending. I promise. It'll only be for a few months. When I asked where the initial capital was from, he casually said, "The deposit from your old flat," as if the $60 CEO zero I'd given wasn't already enough of a foundation. Each time they said for the family, it felt more like a rope tightening, pulling me closer to the edge. Still, as a mother, I kept hoping it was just a rough patch, that things would settle, that my son couldn't possibly be using me. Until that night at the engagement party, when I saw that loan agreement sitting neatly where my dinner plate should have been no warning, no polite invitation, just a table full of relatives, as if they all knew in advance what the main course was. Suddenly, all the scattered pieces, my box room, the cheap sim, the wedding ring, the forged documents slotted together into one clear picture. And that picture told me something I could no longer deny. I wasn't the heart of this family, I was a resource, a tool. And I knew then that unless I made a change, everything I had left, my savings, my pension, my freedom, would vanish. That evening, walking down the narrow hallway back to my little room, I ran my hand along the peeling, white-painted door. The paint, like the facade of this happy family Callum and Sophie had created, looked smooth from afar, but underneath, it was all rot. And I told myself, I won't let that rot spread to the rest of my life. In the days following the engagement party, the storage room seemed smaller, not because anything had changed, but because everything I now knew made it feel that way. I started noticing details I'd once overlooked. One morning, as I stepped into the hallway to make a cup of tea, I caught Sophie live streaming from the lounge. Her voice was sweet, lilting, as she spoke about a minimalist life and the joy of family, with a white bookshelf behind her, adorned with scented candles, tiny cacti, and a few faux wedding photos for inspiration. Not one of them included me. I stood by the kitchen door, waiting for her to finish. When she finally noticed me, her expression darkened just for a second, but it was enough to make me feel like my presence had shattered the brand image she was carefully curating. One afternoon, returning from the library, I found a small box outside the door to my room. Inside was a bank envelope titled Confirmation of Spending Limit Adjustment. I opened it, and my heart slowed. My card had been capped at a mere $10 per day. I marched straight to the kitchen, where Callum and Sophie were chatting. What's going on with my account? The bank says my spending's been limited to £10, I said, holding up the letter. Callum didn't meet my eyes. Mum, it's fine. You don't need much, just basics. Sophie chimed in, voice airy but laced with mockery. Keeping everything in the joint account just helps manage the household better. One less thing for you to worry about. I wanted to slam the glass I was holding onto the table, but instead, I set it down softly. I knew any strong reaction would be labeled sensitive or difficult. The missing gold wedding ring still haunted me. Every time I looked at my bare finger, I remembered Sophie borrowing it for a TikTok, promising just one quick video, then never mentioning it again. One evening, when she was out, I crept into the lounge, hoping to find it. I opened a jewelry box on the shelf filled with shiny new chains, glitzy rings, and even a diamond set in a velvet case, but my old band was nowhere. As I stood frozen, Sophie walked in, phone in hand, eyes locked on me, looking for something. Mom, she asked sweetly, but there was steel behind the smile. Just my reading glasses, I murmured. Her lips curved into a tight grin. I'll get you a new pair, something that suits the aesthetic better. Mr. Patel, the neighbor next door, continued to be a quiet ally. One day, while I was hanging laundry in the garden, he looked around and leaned over the fence. I've noticed Sophie ordering a lot of pricey items online, he whispered, but none of it ends up in her videos. Be careful. Lydia, I used to be an accountant. I know the signs. When outgoings outpace income, people start looking elsewhere to plug the hole. I thanked him, but the dread clung to me all evening. At night, I lay in my little room while their laughter and chatter drifted down from upstairs. Sometimes I'd hear Sophie murmur, if she'd just sign, everything would fall into place. Why is she being so difficult? Or Callum sigh. She thinks she's helping, but she's in the way. At first, I wanted to believe I'd misheard. But the words came too often and too clearly to be coincidence. Subtle efforts to control me began to surface. Every time I planned to be out for more than an hour, Sophie would ask, do you want a lift? Where are you off to? Phrased as kindness, but laced with surveillance. Once, I got back later than expected due to a delayed bus. When I tried the kitchen door, my key didn't fit. They'd changed the lock. Callum brushed it off. We're doing some work in the kitchen, just boil water in your room for a few days. Those few days lasted a week. I made tea next to my bed, the musty air mixing with steam, until I had to crack the window open. Even in the rain. I also noticed Sophie regularly posting photos on social media angles of the house that no longer felt like mine. New wall art, different curtains, all beige and curated. Items I'd once bought with my NHS salary had quietly disappeared. When I asked, Sophie replied, sold the old bits on Marketplace. Use the money to get fresh pieces. You're benefiting too. Aren't you? But I'd never seen a penny. And benefiting apparently meant being allowed to stay in the cupboard under the stairs and asking for kitchen access. Doubt was no longer doubt. It was a quiet, burning certainty. I saw now that I wasn't a family member. I was a financial resource being slowly drained. And the most frightening part was how naturally they did it, as if it were their right. I began documenting everything. Each night, after their footsteps creaked up the stairs to bed, I opened my old notebook and wrote, Data, time, incident. 12th April, card limited to 10 day. 14th April, kitchen lock changed. 16th April, wedding ring still missing. Sophie silent. I kept every bank text, every transaction email, screenshots of Sophie's posts featuring my old belongings. One evening, mid-note, a memory returned to me from years ago. An elderly woman I'd cared for at the hospital once told me, never let anyone sign on your behalf. Love, one signature can cost you your whole life. Back then, I thought it was just a wise woman's musings. Now, it was gospel. Every little thing from the bargain SIM card to the vanished ring to the locked kitchen was part of a larger pattern. I didn't yet know what their next move would be, but I could feel myself standing at the edge of something deep. Each small decision was another nudge closer to the cliff. And then, that night at the engagement party, I realized they weren't nudging anymore. They were waiting for me to jump. I closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and lay down on the narrow bed. The ceiling felt lower than ever, pressing down. But I knew one thing. If I didn't prepare now, tomorrow I'd have nowhere left to stand. And I also knew this whatever had been quietly brewing beneath the surface had finally taken root. And soon, it would break through, and none of them would be able to pretend it wasn't there. Whenever money came up, Callum spoke with the confidence of someone who thought he'd read every financial expert under the sun. But I knew better. The only thing he was truly skilled at was spending faster than he earned. After the engagement party, the financial puzzle pieces I'd previously ignored began slotting together, and the full picture wasn't pleasant. One Monday morning, I was folding laundry when Callum knocked on the storage room door, laptop in one hand, a stack of papers in the other. "Mom, I want you to see this," he said, dragging a plastic chair over to my bed. The laptop screen displayed a color-coded spreadsheet, rows of blinding yellow cells. "It's our business plan, me and Sophie's. You know, the boutique home gym idea. The trend now is high-end fitness experiences at home, like spa meets gym. If you co-sign, the bank will approve a $120, 0 loan at just 9% interest. We'll pay it back in 18 months. I read it all silently until my eyes landed on a small note at the bottom. Secured capital, Lydia Hart's pension fund, to be temporarily transferred to joint account for investment growth. My throat tightened. "And how long is temporary supposed to be?" I asked. Callum smiled, light and breezy. "Just a few months. Mom, once the profits come in, we'll pay you back in full promise." But I knew his few months could stretch into forever unless I kept pressing. Sophie stood at the door, arms folded. I turned to her. "That pension is my money for when I can no longer work. It's not venture capital." Sophie shrugged. "But you're still healthy, aren't you? You could do a few shifts if needed. Plus, if the startup succeeds, you'll gain more than if it just sits there doing nothing." I thought back to the 0. I'd wired from the sale of my council flat, the one I'd spent decades in, just to help them with the house deposit. Back then, Callum had promised to include my name on the title deed to protect everyone's interests. Last week, I opened a letter from the council. My name wasn't on any document, and what's your excuse for my name not being on the deed? I asked, voice calm, though I was boiling inside. Callum looked away. "Must have been a paperwork issue. We'll fix it." But Sophie didn't look surprised. In fact, she didn't look at all. That wasn't the end of it. That afternoon, I went to the bank to check my spending limit. The clerk scrolled through my file, then said, "Did you know there was a recent request to change access to your account?" It listed 2 authorized users, Callum Hart and Sophie Blake. A chill ran down my back. "I didn't sign anything like that," I said quickly. The clerk frowned. "Then it could be a mistake, or something more serious. We'll freeze their access while we investigate." Back home, Sophie was live streaming again, this time, showing off the new minimalist kitchen, which I recognized as the space where my oak cupboard once stood. She had replaced it with a glossy white unit. To her viewers, she said, "Investing in your space is like investing in your future. It always pays off." I knew that line wasn't just about kitchen units. That evening, over dinner, Callum circled back to the loan idea. He sat at the table like a man proposing a business merger. "Mom, if you help, we'll make sure you won't have to worry about bills ever again. Council tax, electricity, gas will cover it all. All we need is your signature and your pension. Just temporarily, to use as capital." I put down my spoon and looked him dead in the eye. "So you want me to trade my financial safety for a dream that already needs rescuing before it's even begun?" He opened his mouth to reply, but I raised my hand. "Son, this wouldn't be the first time I helped, but I'm starting to feel like this isn't help anymore. It's extraction. The air at the table turned thick. Sophie set her spoon down and gave a thin smile. "Do you really think we'd let you lose out? This is for the family." I held her gaze. Families don't need contracts and penalty clauses to hold them together. Families talk to each other, they don't swap dinner plates for loan paperwork. I remembered weeks ago finding a receipt for a Force utero massage chair bought from the joint account Callum had once called the House Repair Fund. When I'd asked about it, Sophie said, "We all use it. You can too." But the chair lived in their bedroom. I had never even seen it switched on. All of this pointed to something bigger than a single loan or a business plan. It was a system, a web of small actions designed to pull every ounce of my finances and autonomy into their hands. From the swap to SIM that cut my internet access, to the locked kitchen, to the forged access form at the bank, every step was calculated to limit my control. That night, I sat alone in my little room and opened the notebook I'd been keeping. I added to it. 22nd April, Callum proposes transferring pension to joint account temporarily. Discovered my name is missing from the property deed. Bank confirms unauthorized request to allow Callum and Sophie account access. I underlined unauthorized 3 times. When I finished writing, I stared at the page for a long time. I realized I was standing on a knife edge one step further, and I'd fall into the very trap they'd laid. But if I backed down now, I'd lose not just my savings, but the right to steer the rest of my life. And I knew then it was time to find my way out, before my signature became the knife that cut the last thread of safety I had left. That Friday morning in Manchester was dreary and gray, with drizzle tapping at the windows before I'd even stepped out of bed. I'd planned to stay tucked away in my little room, brew a pot of tea, and finish the secondhand novel I'd picked up at the charity shop last week. But around 10 a.m., Callum knocked, looking unusually cheerful. "Mum, we've got guests coming this afternoon. Make sure you dress nicely." "All right, they'll be here around 5, he said. I asked who was coming. He only replied, "Someone important, someone tied to our family's future." I was about to press further, but Sophie appeared behind him, holding a luxury shopping bag from a high-end fashion label. "Lydia, I got you a new cashmere jumper beige. Matches the house tones. Wear it tonight." "Yeah," she smiled. I looked at the tag over $200. "Why does what I wear have to match the house?" I asked. Sophie chuckled. "Speaking like one does to a child, we'll be taking some commemorative photos. Matching tones make the pictures look more polished." All afternoon, a strange unease settled over me. I changed into the new jumper, looked in the mirror, and felt like I'd become just another well-placed prop in Sophie's carefully curated backdrop. Just before 5 p.m., the doorbell rang. A man in his 50s entered, dressed in a gray suit and carrying a sleek, black leather briefcase. Callum beamed. "Mum, this is Mr. Harris, our financial advisor. He's here to present the partnership plan." I glanced at Sophie, who was fussing over the cushions and whispering to me, "Sit to Callum's left." "Okay, it's the best angle for the camera." We sat at the dining table, but this time, there was no food, just a laptop with a slide deck already open, and in front of me, a new file with a dark blue cover and an embossed bank logo. "Mr. Harris began. Mrs. Hart, I've reviewed the financials and understand you're cautious but deeply devoted to your family. I'd like to walk you through this $120, 0 loan guarantee, so you can feel confident. Truthfully, the risk is minimal." I stayed silent as he went on, bullet pointing the benefits of signing. Every line started with, "Your family will," and ended with phrases like long-term stability, high returns, and secured future. No one asked whether I wanted to be part of this. To them, my signature was a formality, an eventuality. Midway through his pitch, my phone buzzed. A text from the bank. Confirmation. Though $500 withdrawal from account 1. My heart froze. That was my personal savings account, the one I never shared access to. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway to call the bank. The rep confirmed the transaction had been made online, from a newly registered device registered at my own address. I hadn't done it. I knew that for certain. When I returned, I didn't sit. I stood at the head of the table, looking each of them in the eye. Who used my details to withdraw money without my permission? Callum frowned. What are you talking about? Must be a bank error, Sophie added. Maybe you just forgot. Lydia. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, attempting to steer things back. Perhaps we should focus on the main agenda. I cut him off. My main agenda is finding out who stole from my account. Silence. Thick. Heavy. No one spoke. I turned to Callum. You told me tonight was about the family's future. But if that future comes at the cost of everything I have, then this isn't a family. It's a coordinated robbery. Sophie inhaled sharply, ready to object. But I raised my hand. As of today, every document, every bank detail, every piece of post addressed to me will remain in my control. No one touches a thing. Mr. Harris coughed gently, making one last attempt. Mrs. Hart, I think you're overreacting. This really is an opportunity. I locked eyes with him. Mr. Harris, do you have a mother? He paused, then nodded slowly. Then imagine someone went into her home, took her money, and told her it was for the good of the family. Would you call that an opportunity? He said nothing. Quietly, he closed the folder. Callum sighed and mumbled something about how I don't trust my own son. Sophie snapped her laptop shut, avoiding my gaze. I knew from that moment they'd stop pretending to be sweet. When the guest left, I stood by the window, watching the rain grow heavier. Water ran in rivulets down the glass like the paths of every pound I'd lost through misplaced trust. But something else stirred too, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. That night, after Callum and Sophie had retreated into their room, I sat at the tiny desk in the storeroom and opened my notebook. 29th April, surprise meeting with financial advisor. Pressured to sign loan contract. Discovered $2,500 illegally withdrawn from savings account. Decision. Remove all accounts and correspondence from this address. I closed the book and sat still for a moment. They thought today was a presentation of opportunity. But for me, it was the clearest warning yet. And if they saw me as the weakest piece on the board they were about to learn, I had far more moves left than they imagined. Just 3 days after the meeting with Mr. Harris, the real storm hit. That morning, I just finished rinsing the teapot when a sharp knock rattled the kitchen window. The teacup on the table trembled. At the door stood a man in a courier uniform holding a thick envelope stamped with the logo of Briggs & Matthews Solicitors. Mrs. Lydia Hart. This is a recorded delivery. I'll need your signature. I opened the envelope on the spot. Inside was a notice of intent to pursue legal action. It stated that I had unilaterally reneged on a verbal agreement to act as guarantor, and that my decision had caused significant financial harm to the business venture of Mr. Callum Hart and Miss Sophie Blake. I was given 7 days to honor the commitment. The paper felt both cold and burning in my hands. I didn't need to ask who'd arranged for it. I folded the letter, stuffed it in my bag, and walked straight to the living room, where Callum and Sophie were lounging. He was watching football with his feet on the table. She was curling her hair in the mirror. I dropped the letter onto the coffee table. Care to explain? Callum glanced at it. Oh, that. We just needed to show you we're serious. You know, time is money, Sophie added smoothly. You're holding this entire family's future in your hands. If you keep hesitating, we'll lose the deal. The deposit, our credibility. This was just to help you understand the urgency. I let out a low laugh colder than any words I could have spoken. Urgency. You hired lawyers to threaten your own mother, to paint me as the one tearing this family apart. Callum shrugged. You're taking it too personally. It's business, not emotion. That sentence, it's business. Not emotion sliced deeper than any insult. I'd lived my entire life putting family before everything. And now, my son was telling me feelings didn't belong in the equation. I sat down, eyes fixed on him. If this is business, then fine. But know this, I know how to do business too, and I don't make deals with people who threaten me into submission. The tension in the room stretched like piano wire. Sophie stood, arms folded. If you won't sign, we'll have to find another way. But don't say we didn't warn you if that affects you. Is that a threat? I asked calmly. She smiled thin and sharp. just being honest. That night, I heard them arguing in their room. Snippets drifted through the floorboards. She won't sign. Find another route. Sell her car if we have to. I lay in bed, heart pounding but mind clear. The gloves were off. This wasn't persuasion anymore. It was war. The next morning, for some reason, my room key no longer worked. I called upstairs. Sophie's voice floated down. "Oh, the lock jammed. Callum will fix it later." I waited nearly an hour before I was let in and immediately noticed something off. Drawers had been disturbed. My notebook, the one where I'd documented everything, wasn't in its usual place. When I opened it, I saw the last 2 pages where I'd written about the meeting with Mr. Harris and the unauthorized 2R. 500 withdrawal had been torn out. I walked straight to the living room and placed the damaged notebook on the coffee table. "Who did this?" Callum grimaced. "Mum, you're being paranoid. Maybe the pages fell out." I glanced at the closed window. No breeze. No chance. If you think tearing out a few pages erases the truth, then you've underestimated me. Later that day, I rang Mr. Patel next door. My voice was low, deliberate. I told him just enough. After a long pause, he said, "Lydia, you need to store your documents elsewhere. You can't keep anything important in that house. I've got to safe use it." I thanked him and agreed to bring the file round that evening. But I never made it that far before something else happened. That evening, while preparing a simple supper in the kitchen unlocked for the first time in days, Callum walked in and closed the door behind him. "Mum, I don't want things to get ugly, but if you're not going to help, you need to understand this house. These bills, we have the right to ask you to contribute more or move out." I stared at him. "Are you threatening to throw me out?" He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes answered everything. I set down the spoon, dried my hands, and said evenly, "If you see me as a burden, then don't worry. Soon, you won't have to carry me at all." I walked back to my room, locked the door. That night, I carefully gathered what was left copies of important documents, screenshots, statements, old photos of David, and slipped them into a tote bag. At 9 p.m., I walked to Mr. Patel's. He opened the safe, placed the bag inside, locked it, and tucked the key into his coat pocket. "You've got at least one safe place now," he said. When I returned, Callum and Sophie were on the sofa. The TV was on, but neither was watching. Sophie looked up and smiled a thin, cutting smile. "Off somewhere secret tonight, were you?" I replied. "Just needed a bit of fresh air. It's suffocating in here." And I walked straight back to my room knowing, without a shred of doubt, that this battle had fully begun. And this time, I wouldn't be waiting for the next blow. On Sunday morning, Manchester woke to a rare streak of sunshine. Light filtered through the blinds of the storage room, falling on the rough wall and the clock that now ran nearly 10 minutes slow. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding a cold cup of tea, staring at that light like it was a silent signal. It was time to act, not just react. Not anymore. I thought back to my days as a nurse when decisions had to be made in seconds, in life or death moments. Hesitation could mean losing a patient. Now, hesitation could mean losing everything, not just money, but my autonomy. I began by opening a brand new notebook I'd bought at W.H.S. Smith the week before, a notebook no one knew about. On the first page, I wrote in capital letters, "Self-Protection Plan." Below it, I drew 3 columns, finance, legal, and personal. Under finance, the first step, freeze all accounts. I rang the bank, asked them to revoke all delegated access, cancel any secondary cards, and redirect all future correspondence to a P box I just registered in the city center. When the clerk asked why, I replied, "Personal safety." My voice didn't waver. This wasn't optional. It was survival. Next, I transferred the remainder of my pension into a brand new account, one only I could access. Most importantly, I scheduled an appointment with a solicitor, Margaret Doyle, a name David once mentioned, an old family acquaintance. The meeting was set for Tuesday morning at her Deansgate office. Under legal, I wrote, Verify property ownership. Confirm current legal standing. Request investigation into forged signatures and unauthorized transactions. Prepare statement in case police report is necessary. I needed legal counsel before making any further moves. In the personal column, I wrote just 2 lines. Remain calm in face of provocation and avoid isolation. I remembered Mr. Patel's warning. Don't show weakness. They'll use it around midday, just as I finished outlining the plan. Callum knocked. "Mom, we need to talk." Sophie stood behind him, arms folded. We sat at the dining table, and Callum began, "We've recalculated. If you won't sign, you'll need to start paying rent and living expenses. About $500 a month." I looked him straight in the eye. "All right," I said. They froze. Sophie frowned. "What do you mean?" I repeated, calmly. "If you want to treat me like a tenant, then I'll leave like one on my terms. No obligations, no guarantees, no opportunities." Callum narrowed his eyes. "Where would you go? You've no property now." I smiled gently. "You worry about your plans. I'll handle mine." I stood, returned to my room, and as I shut the door, I heard Sophie mutter, "She's planning something," to which Callum replied, "Be careful. She's not as clueless as you think." That afternoon, I caught the bus into the city. First stop, the copy shop. I printed out every screenshot bank alerts, transaction emails, the solicitor's letter threatening legal action. Then I collected the key to my box. The manager, a gray-haired woman, handed it to me with a warning, "Keep this safe." It's the only one. I held it tightly in my palm. It felt like holding on to power. On the way back, I stopped by Mr. Patel's house. I handed him an envelope containing original documents and a USB stick with digital copies. "Just being cautious," I said. He nodded solemnly. "So you've decided, haven't you?" "I have, and I'm not backing down this time." That evening, when I returned home, Sophie was live streaming again. Her voice echoed through the living room. "Family is where you're supported, not abandoned." I stood in the doorway, watching the ring light bounce off her carefully powdered skin. All I could think was, let's show people what your version of support really looks like. I headed back to my room, opened the notebook, and wrote a single sentence on a fresh page. "Today, I choose to resist." Not because I enjoyed confrontation, but because I knew, if I didn't act now, I'd lose myself completely. And for a woman who'd already lost a husband, a home, and her health, the one thing I refused to surrender was my dignity. From that moment on, I wasn't just defending anymore. I was preparing for battle. Every move from here would be made with surgical precision, decisive, sharp, and with no room left for mistakes. That evening, after writing the words, "Today I choose to resist," in my new notebook, I sat still for a long while. The tea had gone cold. The yellow light of the storage room lamp cast shadows on the stained wall, and I realized this wasn't the first time I'd found myself in this kind of situation. I'd met people like Callum and Sophie before. I'd been hurt before for trusting the wrong hands. Back in 1997, when I was a nurse at Salford Royal, I became friends with a colleague named Brenda. She just transferred to our ward, chatty, warm, always talking about her family and a recent heartbreak. We grew close quickly. Even spent weekends shopping or having tea at mine. One day, Brenda showed up looking pale and drained. She said she was in financial trouble. Her ex-husband had cleaned out her account, and she asked if I'd co-sign a small loan so she could buy a car to get to work. I believed her. It was fine. Seller, not a fortune, but enough to think twice about. Still, I told myself, friends help friends. 3 months later, Brenda vanished from the hospital. No notice. No forwarding number. The bank called me for the debt. It took me nearly 3 years to pay it back with interest. I swore then, never again would I sign anything for anyone. Not for money. Not for goodwill. Never. And yet, more than 20 years later, I was standing at the edge of the same pit. Only this time, the one digging it was my own son. That realization sent a cold shiver through me. Not just sadness, a kind of quiet, sickened understanding. I thought of David, my husband, who was always cautious with money. He used to say, "Money is a tool, Lydia, but if you hand someone else the tool, they'll use it for their purpose, not yours." When he died of a sudden heart attack, Callum and I clung to each other. But even then, I noticed his impatience with saving. He wanted everything now, the car, the gadgets, and I'd bailed him out more than once. There was one thing I'd never told anyone, not even Callum, in 2010, just after David passed. I nearly lost my council flat in Hume. A loan had been taken out in my name without my knowledge. I confronted Callum when the debt letter arrived. He was 23 then, eyes watery. "I just wanted to fix up the flat for you." "Mum, I swear I meant to pay it back." And I believed him. I paid the loan. We never spoke of it again. Those memories returned like a rush of cold water, but instead of weakening me, they sharpened me. Callum didn't become this way overnight. I had unknowingly taught him that no matter how big the mistake, Mum would save the day. And Sophie, clever and polished, simply slid into the same pattern, refined it, dressed it up, and made it look like strategy, sitting alone in that little room. I pictured David at the kitchen table, stirring his tea, talking about contingency plans. He once told me, "If the day ever comes when things feel off, make sure you've got two things: your legal documents somewhere safe, and a sum of money no one else knows about." Back then, I'd smiled and told him he was being too cautious. Now I knew he was just prepared. The past wasn't just old pain. It was a roadmap. I opened my notebook and added a new heading, Lessons from Before. Beneath it, I wrote, "Never sign anything without legal review. Keep an independent financial reserve untouchable. Document everything. Don't trust memory alone." Close to midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. The door handle to the storage room shifted. Someone tested it. I stayed still, heart pounding, but didn't move. The footsteps eventually retreated. And in that moment, I knew I was right to have hidden my documents with Mr. Patel. When I finally lay down, I didn't feel scared anymore. What I felt was something else familiar, almost clinical. Like before a difficult surgery, I had my scalpel, my thread, my gloves. Now all I needed was the right moment to begin, because the past had taught me well, and this time, I wouldn't repeat a single mistake. On Tuesday morning, I woke earlier than usual, wrapped myself in my old gray wool coat, and looped the scarf David had bought in Edinburgh around my neck. I didn't want to draw attention, so I left the house while Callum and Sophie were still asleep. The air outside was damp, but I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Today was my meeting with solicitor Margaret Doyle, and I knew this was the first step in my counterattack. Margaret's office was on the third floor of a red brick building on Deansgate. She was in her 60s, petite but sharp-eyed, with a clear, confident voice. The moment I gave her a brief overview, she set her pen down and looked me straight in the eye. "Lydia, the first thing we need to do is protect you from any legal or financial action they might try behind your back. You've kept evidence that gives us an edge." I handed over my folder, printed screenshots, transaction confirmations, and the legal notice from Briggs and Matthews. Margaret scanned quickly, her brow furrowing at points. When she reached the part about the unauthorized one-to-ones, 500 withdrawal, she tapped her pen on the desk. "This is serious. We could go to the police right now, but my advice, hold off for now. The more noise we make early on, the more they'll try to cover their tracks." We made a list of actions. 1, Margaret would send a formal letter to the bank, requesting an investigation into the transaction and a signature verification. 2, she'd contact the land registry to obtain the property records, confirming whether I had been excluded from the deed. 3, she would draft an official notice of non-guarantee to send directly to Mr. Harris and Briggs and Matthews, shutting down any claims that I'd agreed verbally. As I stood to leave, Margaret placed her hand firmly on the folder. "Don't let them see fear, Lydia. From now on, any conversation should be witnessed or legally recorded. And remember, don't argue when you're on the back foot. We'll strike when the advantage is ours." On the way home, I stopped at a small electronics shop in Chorlton. I bought a mini voice recorder disguised as a pen, and a portable hard drive. I also picked up a new notebook, a tactical journal for documenting sensitive conversations. When I got home, Sophie was in the kitchen, hair tied back, tapping away at her laptop. She looked up and said, in a tone too casual to be innocent, "Out and about today. Were you just running some errands?" I replied, placing the shopping bag on the counter. "Oh, you seem busy. Hopefully not spreading gossip about us to anyone important." I smiled, deliberately ambiguous. Who's to say, Sophie? That evening, when Callum returned, I tested the recorder by slipping it into my jacket pocket. I said, "Callum, I want to be clear about the loan. I'm not signing. I've also spoken with the bank regarding the TUS 500 transaction." He raised an eyebrow. "Are you threatening me?" "No, I'm protecting myself." I let that hang in the air. When I played the recording back later, I heard it just a slight change in his voice. Tension. Awareness. The next day, I began gathering more evidence. I dug through old emails from Callum and Sophie. Some contained lines like, "If Mum cosigns, the bank will fast-track the deal and will cover everything she just needs to sign." I printed everything, numbered the pages, and organized them into a binder. That afternoon, I texted Mr. Patel, "I have more documents for safekeeping tonight." When I dropped them off, I shared some of Margaret's plan. He nodded. "Good. But be ready. They'll push harder. People like that don't stop when blocked. They just find another angle." He was right. Just a day later, Callum came to my room with a new proposal. "Mum, this is a revised offer. You don't need to guarantee the full loan, just a portion." I glanced at the paper. That portion was $60. Thosaro, exactly what remained in my pension fund. I placed the document back on the table. Calmly, "The answer is still no. And if you bring me any more financial paperwork without involving my solicitor, I'll consider it attempted fraud." Callum's expression changed. No more polite veneer, just a tight jaw and a silent exit. I knew this refusal would escalate things. But I was ready. That night, I wrote in the tactical journal, "Declined revised proposal, anticipate retaliation, install recorders in multiple locations, secure all personal documents, passport, license, store off-site." Before bed, I looked around the small storage room. It was still cramped, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a command center. I knew each next move. And more importantly, I wasn't cornered anymore. I was choosing the battlefield now. And when Margaret had everything ready, I would strike the first blow, one they wouldn't see coming. 2 days after my meeting with Margaret, I received a call from an unknown number while waiting at the bus stop. "Mrs. Lydia Hart, this is Alan Price, an old friend of David's. I met with Margaret this morning. She mentioned you might be in a bit of a situation." Alan, a name I hadn't heard since David's funeral. He used to work with David at a construction firm before branching out to start his own business. I remembered him as kind, always joking, and respectfully distant. "I'm not sure what Margaret told you," I said cautiously. "Not much. Just enough to understand you're being financially cornered. I've got a friend in a bank's fraud investigation unit. If you want, I can help look into that unauthorized transaction you mentioned." I hesitated. In my world now, help no longer came freely or without strings, but something in Alan's voice felt grounded. "No sales pitch. No pity." "All right, but I want everything done above board. Transparent? Absolutely. I don't get involved unless it's all by the book." That afternoon, we met at a small cafe in Ancoats. Alan had brought his laptop and a thin folder. He showed me a sample transaction report highlighting a suspicious new device login and a flagged internal IP. He pointed to the final entry. "This is the 500 withdrawal. It came from the same Wi-Fi network as yours, but the device was registered the day before. If formally confirmed, that could be used as evidence for unauthorized access." I stared at the numbers. The timestamps, it felt like finding a crucial puzzle piece. Alan continued, "I also know someone who specializes in property rights. If needed, I can ask them to look into your son's house deed. If we can prove your name was once on it and then removed improperly, you may be able to file for restoration." For the first time in weeks, I felt I wasn't alone. It wasn't just Margaret now, I had Alan, someone with skills and connections I didn't have on my own. As we parted ways, Alan said, "Don't thank me, Lydia. David once helped me save a major contract back in 2005. I owe him. This is me repaying that debt." On my way home, I stopped at Mr. Patel's and handed him a printed copy of Alan's report. He skimmed it, gave a low whistle. Having someone like this on your side, you've just halved the distance to safety, but keep it quiet. If they find out you have allies, they'll be more careful. That night, I sat in the storage room and for the first time dared to sketch out a counterattack path in bold red ink. Use Alan's findings to strengthen the legal case with Margaret. If possible, pursue reinstatement of my name on the property title. Choose the right moment to go public before they can shift their strategy. I closed the notebook and listened to Callum and Sophie laughing in the lounge. This time, their laughter didn't sting. It simply reminded me they had no idea a new player had just entered the field, and that player might change everything. Friday morning, and Manchester's sky was thick and gray, as if someone had draped a heavy blanket over the city. I sat in the storage room, watching the wall clock. 10 to 9. Just 20 minutes until the plan Margaret and I had spent over a week preparing would finally be set in motion. The day before, Margaret had rung with an update. "Lydia, we've gathered enough evidence. I'm sending a legal warning letter to Briggs and Matthews and Mr. Harris. It will formally state that you are under no obligation to guarantee any loans and demand they cease all threats. I'll also forward a copy to the bank, along with Alan's findings on the unauthorized transaction." The plan was simple. Send both email and physical copies simultaneously so no one could pretend they hadn't received anything. Most important of all, I wanted Callum and Sophie to find out not from me, but from someone else. Exactly 9 a.m., my phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. Sent. Countdown begins. I took a deep breath, composed my face, and walked upstairs to the lounge. Callum was staring at his phone. Sophie was typing on her laptop. Within 5 minutes, I watched Callum's face flush deep red. "Did you see this?" He snapped at Sophie. She skimmed the email, then slammed her laptop shut. She actually brought in a solicitor. I sat down with my cup of tea, voice calm and measured. "Something wrong." Sophie turned to me, eyes blazing. "You just sent a formal refusal to co-sign and accused us of stealing." I took a sip of tea. "Not accused. I've laid out the facts. And if the truth is uncomfortable, perhaps it's time to reflect on your choices." The room thickened with tension. Callum jumped to his feet, pointing a finger at me. "We need that money to secure the gym contract. You've just ruined everything." I set my teacup down, voice low but steady. "No, Callum, I didn't ruin anything. I'm simply stopping people from using my name and money for something I didn't choose." I pulled an envelope from my coat and placed it on the table. That's a copy of the transaction report, signed by the bank's fraud department. The device used to withdraw the $500 was registered at this address on the 28th of April. If you want to deny it, you'll need stronger evidence. Sophie let out a short, dry laugh, but I noticed her hands tighten. "So this is a threat now?" "No, just a notice. From now on, everything goes through legal channels." I stood, returned to the storage room, and left them with their silent fury. Inside, I felt something shift. For the first time in months, I wasn't defending, I had struck first. That afternoon, Margaret called back. Briggs and Matthews replied. They say they'll review the file and pause any legal action, pending further information. Translation: they don't want to get caught up in a potential fraud case. At the same time, the bank confirmed a formal investigation had been launched. Alan texted, "They're pulling footage from online banking logins. If it matches the IP location at your house, it's game over." That evening, I sat alone at my small desk. Writing in the tactical journal, 17th May, legal notice sent. Opponents caught off guard. Reacted with anger. Bank and law firm now investigating. First strike landed. As I set the pen down, I noticed something. My hands weren't trembling anymore. This time, I wasn't the one being hunted. I was the hunter. and the prey had just realized the rules of the game had changed. 2 days after the legal letter was sent, the atmosphere in the house shifted completely. Callum stopped pretending to be polite. He barely spoke to me, offering only cold looks whenever he passed the storeroom. Sophie, on the other hand, adopted a different strategy. Open sarcasm designed to unsettle me, even in front of others. On Monday morning, while I was making tea, Sophie leaned against the kitchen doorway, voice honeyed but laced with intent. It must be lovely to have so much free time in this house, enough to write letters to solicitors. Must feel powerful, doesn't it? I didn't respond. I placed the kettle down and poured my cup of tea, but I recognized that for her, this was just the opening act. By the afternoon, an email arrived from Briggs and Matthews. It was brief. We have received a response from our clients, Callum Hart and Sophie Blake. They assert that all actions regarding the 2,500 transaction and the loan guarantee were carried out with your implied consent. We request that you provide counter evidence within 5 working days. I printed it and added it to my file. Margaret called immediately after I forwarded the scanned copy. This is a standard counter-strike, she said. They're trying to weaponize the notion of implied consent, innings invisible and hard to contest without strong proof. But we've got technical data from Alan and those email conversations. Don't worry. That evening, Callum knocked unexpectedly on my door. His nerves were frayed, his composure gone. Are you trying to turn this into a war? Because if you want it, we'll fight it till the end. I looked him straight in the eye, voice steady. I didn't start the war, son, but if it's one you want, I will end it. Next day, Sophie began making secretive calls, pulling down the tone of her voice when I walked past, hanging up instantly. Once, she left an email fragment open on the table, press enquiry, local business feature. In that moment, I understood they were scheming to manipulate the narrative in the media, to cast me as the selfish mother wrecking her son's life. I called Alan at once. He sighed into the phone. I'd guess that's where this would go. But remember, media is a double-edged sword. If they try to spin a story, let's make sure your side goes public first. With evidence. Minutes later, and just as expected, I received a message from someone claiming to be a reporter at the Manchester Gazette, wanting to hear your perspective before we publish. I scheduled a meeting for the weekend and immediately informed Margaret so she could prepare. Meanwhile, Callum began curtailing my access around the house. First, he locked the main fridge, relegating me to a battered mini-fridge in my room. Then he changed the Wi-Fi password without telling me, but I didn't react. Instead, I silently bought a backup 4G SIM card, my own secure connection. Margaret texted, "You're doing well. Don't let them drag you into an emotional tug-of-war every time they try a point for your case." On Thursday night, I overheard them arguing in the living room. Callum's voice carried. "I told you she'd crumble. Now look, she's got legal backup and Alan supporting her." Sophie was cold. "Just get her out in the open. Once people see how greedy she is, she'll lose all credibility." I listened from my room. They didn't get it. I've been preparing for a public move for ages. And the more they lash out, the stronger my evidence becomes. By tomorrow, I'll be handing Margaret recordings of the recent conversations, especially Sophie admitting, "Lock her storeroom again." That will be the final tactical prep before flipping the narrative entirely. They think the pressure will break me. But as I watch them flail, I'm more convinced than ever. The more they resist, the more they pave the path to their own downfall. On Saturday morning, light rain fell gently, and a mist draped over the street outside. I woke earlier than usual, not from sleeplessness, but from knowing that today everything would pivot. The interview with the Manchester Gazette had been confirmed, and Margaret had assembled the entire dossier, facts, evidence, and a strategy to bring the story into the open. At 9 a.m., Margaret and Alan arrived at my door. I led them to the storeroom, the place I'd once felt locked away. But now the war room of our operation. Margaret laid out the evidence. Printed emails, bank transaction reports from Alan, screenshots, and most important, recorded audio clips I had captured. When they hear Sophie say, Lock her storeroom again. There'll be no doubt it's deliberate pressure, Margaret said, eyes steady and determined. At 11 a.m., the reporter, Claire, arrived. She was in her 30s, hair tied back neatly, her eyes sharp with curiosity. She began with a gentle prompt. "Mrs. Hart, would you tell me in your own words what's really been happening here?" I recounted it all from the meeting with Mr. Harris, the pressure to guarantee loans, to discovering the unauthorized withdrawal. I spared no detail. Whenever I mentioned a document or message, Margaret would hand it to Claire. Claire nodded as she noted, absorbing every nuance. When it came to the recordings, Alan played the clip of Sophie saying, "Lock her storeroom again," followed by Callum's, "She's making it difficult for herself." Claire's brow flickered in surprise. "Are you comfortable with us using these in full uncut, verbatim in the piece?" she asked. "I am," I replied, voice unwavering, as long as the context is preserved. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. Before she left, Claire added, "I think readers will relate to your story, especially because it reflects a broader issue, the financial rights and dignity of older adults." That afternoon, I sat by the storeroom window, watching rain trickle down the glass. I knew the article wouldn't just shake Callum and Sophie, it could undermine their credibility with any business partner stuck in the wings. I didn't regret it for a moment. 2 days later, the feature appeared on the local features front page, "The Defiant Mother," a story of financial protection and self-respect. The photo was a close-up of an elderly hand clutching a stack of documents. The article retold my story, backed by evidence, with full names of Callum and Sophie included. Social media erupted. "What an admirable woman. So many people are taken for granted. Like this, someone had to speak up. I hope she wins the case." Back home, the atmosphere had become dangerously tense. Callum threw the newspaper onto the table, his face pale. "Mother, you've destroyed everything I've worked for." I remained calm. "No, my son, I merely protected what was mine. What's left, that's yours. If you haven't destroyed it yourself." Sophie said nothing, but her hands trembled visibly. She knew as the public turned against her, reputational recovery would become nearly impossible. That same afternoon, Margaret received an email from Briggs and Matthews. "Our clients wish to resolve this matter out of court. We request that no further public statements be made until an agreement is reached." Margaret smiled and turned to me. "They're signaling surrender. They know a court, backed by public opinion and evidence, would destroy them." That evening, I wrote in my tactical journal, 24 May public reversal achieved. Opponents are discredited and initiating settlement. We remain firmly in control for the first time in weeks. I slept deeply. I didn't dream, because I knew from now on I held the reins to the story entirely. 3 days after the article went live, Briggs and Matthews sent a formal email requesting a meeting to undertake a peaceful resolution. Margaret accepted immediately, reminding me, "Lydia, this isn't a familial reunion, it's a rights negotiation. You stand firm. Do not concede anything outside what we've already decided." The meeting was held in a glass-walled conference room on the 10th floor of a newly built office block in Spinningfields. Margaret, Alan, and I sat on one side. Opposite us sat Callum, Sophie, and their solicitor. No one held anybody's gaze any longer than a few seconds. Their lawyer opened. "Our clients wish to resolve this swiftly to avoid further damage to personal and business relationships. We propose that Mrs. Hart retract some of her public statements in exchange for them dropping any guarantee obligations and refraining from legal action." Margaret didn't hesitate. "No, our terms are full repayment of the unauthorized $500 withdrawal, with statutory interest, a written commitment that Mrs. Hart's name, signature, or financial details will never be used in future transactions. Mrs. Hart retains full right to publicly share her personal experience." Alan added, "And if needed, we're prepared to escalate this to criminal investigation." Callum frowned, ready to speak, but Sophie gently laid her hand on his. For a moment, I saw a hesitation flicker in her eyes, a rare sight. Their solicitor excused themselves for a brief private discussion. 10 minutes later, they returned, their faces noticeably more somber. The lawyer spoke. Our clients agree to these terms. Provided Mrs. Hart signs a release, waiving any further claims over past financial arrangements. Margaret glanced at me. I nodded. I wasn't looking to dredge up older grievances. What mattered was securing my present and future. By the end of the meeting, we had signed the agreement. The bank would process the repayment within 7 days. I stepped into the hallway, looking down at the traffic below. Weight lifted, I felt like I'd removed a massive boulder that had been pressing on me for months. On the way home, Margaret smiled at me. You know, Lydia, few people in your situation remain steady enough to see this through. You didn't just retrieve your money, you delivered a message to countless others. That evening, I noted in my tactical journal, 27 May, settlement reached. Funds returned, plus protective agreement in place. The battle is officially over. Yet, I know the memory of this chapter will remain with me long after the ink dries, a reminder that sometimes, in order to preserve your dignity, you must be willing to fight all the way. A week after signing the settlement, I woke up in my familiar storeroom, but everything felt different. The heavy footsteps outside were gone. The snide remarks stopped most importantly. I knew everything around me was finally safe. The $20 finard plus statutory interest had been transferred into my new account. I also received a stamped commitment from Briggs and Matthews affirming that no one may use my name, signature, or personal information for any transactions going forward. Each time I looked at that sealed envelope, I felt as if I'd crossed a narrow bridge without falling. I began to tidy the storeroom, folding clothes, organizing documents, discarding completed notes. I gently removed an old photograph of David from the wall and smiled. He'd see now, after all. I did keep what was mine, I murmured. Alan still called occasionally to check in. Mr. Patel invited me over for tea, saying, "You have earned a moment of peace. Victory isn't just about survival, it's about living better." I decided to invest part of the funds in a short financial literacy course at the community center. I wanted to understand better how to protect myself and maybe someday share that knowledge with people in similar situations. As for Callum and Sophie, they moved out just 2 days after the repayment. There was no goodbye, just the sound of the front door slamming behind them. I didn't feel bitterness, only a strange emptiness. They remain family, but I no longer have to sacrifice everything for them. That evening, I sat by the window, watching the golden streetlights shimmer on the rain-slicked pavement. I reflected on the months past from being cornered to standing firm and launching my own fight. This story wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming the control of my life. I opened my tactical journal to the final page and wrote, "This may be the end, but not forgotten. Sometimes you must almost lose everything to know what truly matters. And once you know, don't let go even if it means standing alone." I closed the journal and placed it on the shelf. Outside, the wind blew harder, but inside me, there was peace. I knew that if someone ever tried to push me down again, I wouldn't just stand back up, I would rise stronger, and I would make sure they remembered that Lydia Hart isn't someone easily broken. And that's the message I hope anyone hearing this story remembers. Dignity isn't something granted to you by others. It's something you must hold on to with your own 2 hands. Lydia Hart's story isn't only a battle to reclaim finances or property, it's a journey of awakening. A woman seemingly cornered found her voice, her independence, and her dignity again. The greatest lesson here, never entrust all your faith or control to someone else, even family. Trust should be accompanied by clear boundaries, and those boundaries must be defended through awareness, the law, and your own resolve. To many older adults across the UK, this is a reminder. Safeguarding your assets, rights, and dignity isn't selfish. It's your duty to yourself. Silence often emboldens wrongdoers, but when you speak up, often difficult at first, you'll discover you're stronger each day. Keep your important documents secure. Record everything, and never hesitate to consult a lawyer or a trusted friend when necessary. If this story resonates, please share it, especially with parents. Grandparents, they should know they are not alone. The little steps you take to protect yourself today can become the shield for all your tomorrow. Wishing you strength, clarity, and peace as you guard what is most precious to you,